On the 27th of March 1977, on a fog-bound island in the Atlantic, two of the largest aircraft ever built tried to occupy the same 300 feet of runway at the same instant. Neither crew could see the other. Between them, in the space of a few seconds, 583 people were about to die. It remains, to this day, the deadliest accident in the history of flight, and what makes it unbearable is that almost nothing about it happened in the air. It happened on the ground, in the fog, in the silence after a radio call that was never fully heard. This is not the story of one careless man. It is the story of how a bomb, a small airport, a bank of fog, a crowded frequency, and the quiet weight of authority lined up, one after another, until there was no room left for error. This is the anatomy of Tenerife. It began as an ordinary Sunday. Two Boeing 747s on opposite sides of the ocean, bound for the same warm island in the sun. The first was KLM Flight 4805, a charter out of Amsterdam, carrying 235 holidaymakers and 14 crew toward Gran Canaria. In command was one of the most respected pilots in Europe. The second was Pan Am Flight 1736, the Clipper Victor, out of Los Angeles by way of New York, carrying 380 passengers and 16 crew. Many were retirees, bound for a Mediterranean cruise, a lifetime savings spent on a single bright holiday. Both were headed for Las Palmas, the airport on Gran Canaria. Neither would ever arrive, because that morning someone had decided to make a point with a bomb. At about 1:15 in the afternoon, a bomb planted by a Canary Islands separatist group exploded in the passenger terminal at Las Palmas. 8 people were injured. Then came a warning of a second device, and the authorities did the only prudent thing. They closed the airport. But an airport does not close in isolation. Dozens of aircraft were already in the sky over the Atlantic, low on options and, some of them, low on fuel. They had to go somewhere, and the nearest field large enough to take them was a small regional airport on the neighboring island of Tenerife, a place called Los Rodeos. Pan Am asked to circle instead. The Clipper had the fuel to wait, and its passengers were tired, but Las Palmas was the destination of record, and the crew were told, firmly, to divert with the rest. It was the first small decision made by someone else that put them on that runway. One after another, the diverted aircraft came down out of the cloud onto Los Rodeos. 5 large airliners, among them the 2 747s, crowding onto a field that had never been built for them. Los Rodeos had a handful of parking stands and a tower whose controllers could barely see the field on a good day. Now it held 5 wide-bodied jets it was never built to take, nose to tail, spilling off the apron and onto the very taxiway that was meant to keep them flowing. In a single afternoon, the airport had been turned inside out. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the shape of Los Rodeos. It had a single runway. Running alongside it, one parallel taxiway, the strip an aircraft normally uses to move between the apron and the runway without ever getting in the way of departing traffic. But the taxiway was now a parking lot. So many aircraft had diverted here that they were parked along its length, blocking it, and that left only one path for a departing aircraft to reach the far end of the runway. It had to taxi down the runway itself the whole length and turn around. In the language of aviation, it had to backtrack. This is the trap in miniature. Backtracking means 2 aircraft can share the same strip of concrete nose to nose in a place designed to keep them apart. On a clear day, in sight of one another, it is merely awkward. In fog, it is a loaded gun. And there was one more delay building. The KLM captain decided to refuel here at Los Rodeos rather than at Las Palmas to save time later. It was a reasonable choice. It took about 35 minutes. And while the KLM sat taking on fuel, the Pan Am, parked just behind it, could not get past. Barely 12 feet separated the 2 enormous tails, so both waited. And while they waited, the weather began to change. Los Rodeos sits high, more than 2,000 feet above the sea, and at that altitude, the clouds that drift in off the Atlantic do not float overhead. They roll across the ground. What at a lower airport would be a gray sky becomes, here, a fog that sits directly on the runway. And this fog did not settle evenly. It came in banks, drifting across the field so that the visibility rose and fell minute by minute from nearly half a mile down to a few hundred feet and back again. One moment a pilot could see the length of the runway. The next, he could see almost nothing. And here is the cruel mechanics of it. When the KLM finally lined up, it sat in a pocket of clearer air, perhaps half a mile of visibility, just enough to be legal. But a dense bank of fog was drifting up the runway toward it, only minutes away. To a crew already racing a clock, the weather did not whisper caution. It said, "Go now, while you still can." There was no ground radar at Los Rodeos. The controllers in the tower could not see the aircraft on their field, not on a screen and not through the window. They could only hear them and picture where they were from what the pilot said. On a clear day, that is enough. In this fog, the tower was working blind, holding the whole picture together with nothing but voices on a single crowded radio frequency. Then, in the early afternoon, word came that Las Palmas had reopened. And every crew that had been sitting on that crowded field for hours wanted the same thing, to leave, at once. There is one passenger on the KLM who would not die that day. A young Dutch woman, a tour guide who lived on Tenerife, looked at the pointless short hop to Gran Canaria and back and decided against it. She stepped off the aircraft at Los Rodeos and stayed on her island. Of the 235 who had flown down from Amsterdam that morning, she alone would live. One small, ordinary choice, and the whole difference between living and dying. For the KLM crew, the pressure was sharper than for most. Dutch law had recently tightened the rules on how long a crew could legally work. Captain Van Zanten and his officers were running down against that limit. If they did not get airborne soon, they risked being unable to fly the return leg at all, stranding hundreds of passengers on the island overnight, at enormous cost and disruption. It was not recklessness. It was a clock, ticking, in the back of a professional mind. The rules were not a formality. Under the tightened Dutch law, a captain who flew past his hours faced a criminal penalty, and his airline faced a broken schedule and a stranded aircraft. If Van Zanten ran out of legal time on Tenerife, hundreds of passengers would be left on the island overnight, at great cost. He had a narrow window and a fog that would not lift, standing between him and a very public failure, and so the two 747s began to move. The KLM first, taxiing out onto the runway to backtrack its full length to the far end. The Pan Am following behind, told to taxi down the same runway and then turn off it, to clear the way. The tower gave the Pan Am a specific instruction: taxi down the runway and leave it by the third exit on the left. In the controller's words, the third one, 1, 2, 3, the third. There was a problem with that instruction, one of the quiet controversies at the heart of this disaster. The third exit, C3, did not point the way the Pan Am was traveling. To take it, a 747 would have to swing through a hairpin of nearly 150 degrees, almost back on itself, then do it again to rejoin the taxiway. Investigators concluded that for an aircraft that size, the turn was very nearly impossible. The next exit, C4, was easy. A gentle turn, the way the aircraft was already pointed. And the Pan Am crew, peering into the fog, counting exits they could barely see, were not even certain they had reached the third. They believed the sensible exit, the one meant for them, was the fourth, so they kept rolling, looking for it. And that is the tragedy sitting underneath the tragedy. At the moment it mattered most, the Pan Am was still on the runway, not because its crew were careless, but because the instruction they had been given may not have been possible to follow. At the far end, the KLM completed its turn and lined up, pointing back down the runway it had just traveled, into the fog. And it is worth understanding who was in that cockpit, because the disaster is written in the relationship between three men. In the left seat, Captain Jacob Van Zanten. 50 years old, KLM's chief instructor on the 747, the man who trained other captains, whose face the airline used in its own advertising. He was, by every measure, superb. But he had spent much of the previous 3 months not flying real routes, but sitting in a flight simulator where the man in his seat gives his own clearances and controls the whole exercise. A habit of authority had been quietly forming, one that did not belong on a live runway. Beside him, First Officer Klaus Mers, experienced but new to the 747 with fewer than 100 hours on the type. And the man who had signed off his qualification to fly it only weeks earlier was the captain sitting next to him. Think about what that does to a cockpit. When the most powerful pilot in the airline, the man who tests you, is certain, it is very hard to be the voice that says, wait, and behind them, the flight engineer, Willem Schroeder, 17,000 hours in the air, watching the same runway, hearing the same radio, remember him. Because in the final minute, he is the one who asks the question that might have stopped everything. What follows happened in a little under a minute, on one radio frequency, between 4 voices. It is the most studied 60 seconds in aviation history. And to see how it went wrong, you have to see the words laid out in time. The KLM was lined up, engines ready. The first officer, Mears, told the tower they were ready for takeoff and waiting for their air traffic control clearance. That phrase carries a trap, and the whole disaster turns on it. An air traffic control clearance is not permission to take off. It is only the route you will fly once you are airborne. Which way to turn, how high to climb. Permission to actually begin the takeoff roll is a separate thing, a specific phrase that had not yet been given. The tower read back the route, cleared to the Papa beacon, climb to flight level 90, turn right after takeoff. A string of navigation, nothing more. And as the first officer read that route clearance back into the radio confirming it, he ended with an ambiguous, unscripted phrase. The exact words are disputed to this day, argued over by investigators and linguists. Something close to, and we are now at takeoff. Did he mean we are now in position at the takeoff point? Or did he mean we are now in fact beginning to take off? We cannot be certain because at that exact moment in the seat beside him, Captain Van Zanten was already pushing the throttles forward. In Dutch, quietly he said, "We're going. This is the fracture point, so hold it clearly. In a tired, hurried, expert mind, primed by weeks in a simulator to grant his own permissions, the long string of a route clearance could blur into the single thing he wanted to hear, that he was cleared to go. He was not, but nothing in that cockpit, in that moment, was loud enough to say so. The tower had not cleared them to take off, and the controller, hearing that odd phrase, tried to hold them. He said, "Okay," and then, after a short pause, "Stand by for takeoff, I will call you." That instruction, "stand by for takeoff," would have saved every soul on both aircraft. The KLM crew never heard it, because at the very same instant, on the very same frequency, the Pan Am pressed its own transmit button to say the one thing that mattered. The Pan Am said, "And we are still taxiing down the runway. The Clipper 1736, still on the runway." Directly ahead of the KLM, in the fog, but two radios transmitting at once on the same frequency do not add together. They interfere. They cancel into a shriek, a heterodyne, a squeal of noise that carries no words at all. For about 3.5 seconds, the two most important sentences ever spoken at that airport ground against each other into static. In the KLM cockpit, they heard the tower's reassuring "okay," and then a meaningless squeal. They did not hear "stand by." They did not hear that the Pan Am was still on the runway in front of them. The single thread holding the whole blind picture together had, for 3.5 seconds, been cut. Be exact about why those words were lost. A radio frequency is a single lane, and only one voice can travel it at a time. When two press their transmit buttons together, the signals do not take turns. They beat against one another and dissolve into a tone, a whistle, that no ear can turn back into speech. The very system built to connect that runway had, at the one instant it mattered, disconnected it. There was one more chance. A moment later, the tower and the Pan Am spoke again. Cleanly this time, the Pan Am confirming it would report when the runway was clear. That exchange was audible in the KLM cockpit. It was a plain signal that another aircraft was still out there on the concrete ahead. And it is here that the flight engineer Schroeder leaned forward and asked the question. He said, in Dutch, "Is he not clear then? Is the Pan Am not off the runway?" It was the right question, at the last possible moment, from the man with the least authority in the cockpit. And the captain, already accelerating into the fog, certain, answered him, "Oh yes," and kept going. By now, the KLM was accelerating hard down the runway, into a wall of drifting fog, toward a Pan Am 747 it could not see and did not believe was there. On the Pan Am flight deck, the crew were still hunting for their exit when they saw them. Two landing lights, high and bright, coming out of the murk straight at them. The Pan Am captain slammed his throttles forward and threw the aircraft hard left, trying to claw off the runway onto the grass. The first officer shouting, "Get off! Get off!" The KLM captain, far too fast to stop, hauled his aircraft into the air early, so hard he dragged its tail 200 feet along the concrete, trying to leap over the obstacle he had finally seen. He almost made it. The KLM's nose lifted clear, but the rest of it did not. Its landing gear and its underside struck the Pan Am across the top of the fuselage, tearing the wide-body open, its engines ripping through the upper deck just behind the cockpit. The KLM, mortally wounded, staggered back into the air, stalled, rolled, and came down onto the runway 150 yards beyond, sliding in a sheet of its own burning fuel. It was over in seconds. Two of the largest machines humanity had ever built, reduced to burning wreckage on a foggy runway, in a collision that, from the ground, almost no one had seen coming. On the KLM, there were no survivors. All 248 people aboard were killed instantly, the captain, the crew, and every passenger in the fire. On the Pan Am, in the forward section, a small miracle. The nose of the aircraft where the cockpit was had been torn away from the destruction behind it. Around 70 people, dazed and burned, climbed and jumped out onto the intact left wing and dropped to the ground before the fire reached them. The captain lived, the first officer lived, but behind them, 335 did not. And in the days that followed, 9 of the survivors died of their injuries. Among those survivors was a Pan Am flight attendant named Dorothy Kelly. Thrown clear of the wreck, she turned around and went back into it again and again, dragging injured passengers out of the smoke and onto the wing, among them her own captain, badly burned, whose life she saved. In the worst minutes of the worst accident in the history of flight, there was still that. When the counting was finally settled, the number was 583. It remains the greatest loss of life in any accident in the history of aviation. Many of the dead were exactly who you would fear, retired couples on the holiday of a lifetime who had asked only hours earlier if they might simply be allowed to wait. For weeks, the identification went on, 2 passenger lists checked against what the fire had left. Whole families had been traveling together. On the Pan Am, a ship's worth of couples who had saved for years for one bright trip. The 583 were not a number. They were the ordinary human traffic of a Sunday afternoon going somewhere warm who happened to be routed by a bomb and a fog into the same few seconds. The investigation that followed was one of the largest ever mounted, drawing in the Spanish authorities on whose soil it happened, the Americans and the Dutch. And from the beginning, it carried a painful tension, because the simplest version of the story pointed at one man. The recorders were recovered from both aircraft. The transmissions were timed to the fraction of a second. Investigators walked the runway, measured the turns, and rebuilt the last minute from the wreckage backward. Rarely has a disaster been reconstructed so completely. And the more completely they rebuilt it, the less it looked like the fault of any single person. The Spanish report reached a clear conclusion. The fundamental cause of the accident was that the KLM took off without a takeoff clearance. Captain Van Zanten began his role when he had been cleared only a route, not a departure. He did not stop when the tower said stand by. He did not stop when the Pan Am's calls suggested it was still ahead of him. On the bare facts, that is true, and it is where the chain finally broke. But the Dutch investigators pushed back, and their objection matters because it is what turns this from a story about a mistake into a story about a system. They did not deny that the KLM went too early, but they refused to let it rest on one man. They called it a mutual misunderstanding, and they laid out everything else that had to go wrong first. A route clearance that blurred in a tired mind into permission to go. An okay where there should have been a clear instruction. A standby swallowed whole by the heterodyne. A Pan Am still on a runway it had been told to leave by an exit it could not use. The fog, the missing radar, the crowding, the clock. Take away anyone, and 583 people go home. In the end, KLM accepted civil responsibility and paid the settlements. But the investigators on all sides had come to understand something larger than blame. That the disaster had not been caused by a bad pilot. It had been caused by a good system, working exactly as designed, in conditions it was never designed for. The finding that mattered, in the end, was not whom to punish, it was what to change. And that shift, from the guilty individual to the flawed conditions, is one of the quiet revolutions in how we understand catastrophe. It is why a modern air accident ends not in a courtroom, but in a report, and in 100 small rules written so that the next flight is safer than the last. If you want the deepest cause, it is not in any of the equipment, it is in the cockpit itself. In the distance between the man who was certain and the two men who had doubts. Twice, in that final minute, someone with less authority than the captain came close to stopping it. The first officer at the very start said, "We don't have clearance." The flight engineer at the very end asked, "Is he not clear then?" Both were right. Both were overruled, not by argument, but by the sheer gravitational weight of the most experienced, most respected man in the airline being sure. Expectation had a hand in it too. Van Zanten had spent months in the simulator, where the captain in his seat controls everything and grants his own clearances. He was primed, without knowing it, to hear permission where none had been given. He was not careless. He was a master craftsman, running on a habit that the real world had no room for. Out of those 583 deaths came changes that have, quietly, saved a very great number of lives since. The first was language itself. Aviation rebuilt the way pilots and controllers speak to each other. The word takeoff was locked away. From then on, a controller would only ever say the phrase cleared for takeoff at the single moment of actually clearing an aircraft to go, and at no other time. Every critical instruction had to be read back in full, not answered with a loose okay. An aircraft waiting on a runway would be told, in plain words, hold position. The ambiguity that killed at Tenerife was, sentence by sentence, engineered out of the language. And the second change went deeper than words. Tenerife became the landmark case for a new idea, that a cockpit should not be a kingdom with one absolute ruler. That the junior officers are not passengers but a last line of defense, whose doubts must be spoken and heard and taken seriously, even against the certainty of the captain. Airlines built entire training programs around it. Today it is called crew resource management, and it began, more than anywhere, in the wreckage on that runway. The idea sounds obvious now, that a junior officer should be able to say stop and be heard. It was not obvious then. It cut against a century of the captain as sole and unquestioned master of his aircraft. It took 583 deaths and years of resistance inside the industry to make a cockpit a place where a doubt spoken aloud is not insubordination, but the last defense against disaster. Ground radar came to Los Rodeos, the phraseology spread to every tower on Earth, and the lesson of the two officers who nearly spoke loudly enough is now taught to every airline pilot alive. It is the strange grace of aviation that it learns from its dead more faithfully than almost any other field. Every rule in that cockpit today is written somewhere in a disaster, and a great many of them are written here, in fog, on a runway in the Atlantic, on an ordinary Sunday afternoon. You feel the legacy of that runway every time you fly, and never think about it. In the standard words your pilots read back. In the first officer trained to challenge the captain. In the radar that watches the taxiways. Tenerife is not a distant tragedy. It is built into the silence of every safe flight since. 2 aircraft, 1 runway. A bomb that sent them there, a fog that blinded them, a radio that failed them, and a silence 3.5 seconds long into which 583 people vanished. Not because one man was careless, but because, for a few seconds, the whole system had no room left for a single doubt to be heard. If the forgotten deserve a witness, and a pattern deserves to be remembered,